Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the FHIR Endpoint Discovery and Monitoring session. My name is Matthew Ron. I am the Tools and Testing Branch Chief in the Certification and Testing Division at ONC. We have a very exciting session today. We will be joined by some community stakeholders, and very excited to hear their viewpoint on FHIR Endpoint Discovery and Monitoring. So a little intro about this session. The FHIR servers are proliferating across the nation, making health data more readily available for application developers and consumers. In this session, we'll discuss perspectives on FHIR Endpoint Discovery and Monitoring from a couple industry stakeholders. We will also be debuting the Lantern system being used to monitor availability and adoption of FHIR API service-based URLs by select users across the United States. Joining us today is Wayne Kubik. He is the Chief Technology Officer at HL7, an ANSI-accredited standards development organization dedicated to the vision of a world in which everyone can securely access and use the right health data when and where they need it. He brings 25 years of experience in a variety of technology-focused roles related to pharmaceutical research and healthcare. We also have Ryan Howells, a principal at Levitt Partners. Ryan has worked with the White House, VA, CMS, CCIIO, ONC, and OCR on healthcare issues and is a frequent speaker at major industry events. Ryan currently helps lead the Karen Alliance, a multi-sector public-private alliance focused on providing consumers digital access to their health information. We also have Matt Mayer. He's a senior software system engineer with MITRE Corporation. Matt has experience building software systems across multiple domains, including public health and quality measurement. He is currently leading the Lantern project, an application to monitor availability and conformance of FHIR endpoints. As well, lastly, Michael Nasali is a human factors subject matter expert for the MITRE Corporation. His work in the Health Transformation Technical Center is focused on user interface design, interaction design, user interface engineering, and data visualization. He has been a key contributor to the design and user interface efforts on many MITRE open source health IT projects, including population health monitoring, electronic quality measure testing, electronic health record validation, clinical decision support artifacts, and social determinants of health. So thank you all for joining us. Appreciate agreeing to join the panel, and I'm excited to have you join us. To start, we're going to have Wayne and Ryan speak about their viewpoint on FHIR Endpoint Discovery and Monitoring. After they give their initial thoughts, I will then turn it to the Lantern team to provide an overview and demo of Lantern. Lantern is an open source tool that monitors publicly accessible health IT systems, certified FHIR API endpoints. So I'm going to now turn it to Wayne to speak a little bit about his work in the FHIR Endpoint Discovery and Monitoring and kind of where we are now, and then we'll get Ryan's viewpoint as well. So Wayne?
Well, thank you, Matt, and thanks to ONC for inviting me to attend. I hope my muting was successfully turned off as we go through the mechanism of this webinar. In my role as CTO of HL7, I've certainly been very interested in the advancement of FHIR as a global solution for interoperability. That's what excited me about joining HL7, and it's quite a privilege to work with Graham Grieve and the members of the FHIR community to help them move ahead in accomplishing the great work they're trying to do. I think my first point is that the very fact that this topic is on the agenda is a cause to be celebrated in its own right. It's indicating the further advancement of HL7 FHIR in terms of maturity, acceptance, adoption, and awareness. Several years ago, we were trying to get things working. Now there are so many FHIR applications and implementations being put in place around the world that people are starting to think about this absolutely critical problem of how do APIs or how do FHIR servers find each other through APIs in order to be able to move healthcare information around, to try to be able to find healthcare information, to deliver it to whomever needs it. And this is the fact that that we're getting this, recognizing this as an urgent need is, again, a step forward in terms of our recognition of how FHIR is really starting to change the world of healthcare information. One of the critical reasons why the endpoint discovery, probably the principal reason, is that it's absolutely essential towards enabling an app-based economy like we've seen in the world of technology through the app stores from Apple and Google and others. And the idea is that in order to be able to stimulate the entrepreneurial visions of new and smaller companies who are trying to fill lots of the gaps in healthcare, the gaps that may be around patient access to data, or the gaps about being able to payers to communicate with each other and with providers more effectively. We need to be able to make it possible for the apps to find each other and to talk to each other and to collect the information. And that's what the point of this particular topic is all about. There have been, there is actually as we'll see from our demo, the Lantern demo later, there's a paucity of information out there about all the FHIR servers that are available. And we really ultimately need to be able to provide something like Yellow Pages. So it's possible for someone who needs information, a patient who needs information, for example, from 5 or 6 different providers or specialists or healthcare organizations, to be able to get all that information and aggregate it and to make it available to whomever needs it at that point in time. So that's where I think we're trying to go with this particular problem and this session over here. I think Ryan will have a lot of additional details about some of the business needs in specifics, and I'm pretty excited to see the MITRE demonstration of Lantern, which gives you a sense of the sort of information that FHIR servers can declare to the world. And once you can if you can actually find where they are, to have a sense of what types of capabilities are out there. We have a long way to go on the information collection side. And as we'll talk later, we certainly have some needs about how we can actually manage and make available such a directory in the long term. But I'm pretty excited that we're actually getting to this stage, that we can deal with a problem like this, and that there is much greater recognition across the industry of how important it is in order to advance the vision. I think my last statement Matt had asked me particularly to report on the state of endpoint discovery in other countries internationally. And unfortunately, I sent my queries out a little late to get some information. The summary of it is really very little at this point. There are some government operated directories that are available in some European countries, Denmark and Switzerland, for example. But right now, they're not really holding, they may or may not have many FHIR endpoints. A lot of them are basically servers to enable XCA document exchange and other items, other things like that. But there are some infrastructures in place that are run by governments. The U.S. market is very unique in its way to approach healthcare information. So we certainly have a challenge in how we can best deliver that in order to accomplish this need for the U.S. healthcare environment. So that's all I had initially right now. Looking forward to the panel discussion, the demo, and I'll turn things over to you, Ryan.
Great. Thank you, Wayne. Appreciate the opportunity, and thank you to ONC for allowing us the opportunity to share some thoughts from the work that we are doing within the Caring Alliance in terms of getting consumers digital access to their health information. We appreciate, again, the opportunity to present some thoughts to you today. We'll go to that first slide, the next slide, actually. I think most folks know who we are, but just in case, we were started about 4 years ago with the express desire to allow individuals the ability to really advance the ability for consumers and their authorized caregivers to easily get, use, and share their digital health information where, when, and how they want to achieve their goals. We're a very widespread, multi-sector, multi-stakeholder group that's involved from health plans to consumer platform organizations to EHR vendors to consumer advocacy organizations and advocates themselves to consumer apps to pharmaceutical companies to providers, to others, hospitals, etc., all with the expressed purpose of
hey Ryan,
what are the
sorry to interrupt. It looks like we're not seeing the slides. Mike, if you click share broadcast.
It's broadcast screen share to audience.
Perfect. We see them now.
We okay,
right.
Matt?
Yes, I believe so. If you go back.
Yep. Yeah, it looks good.
Great. Thanks for the, glad they're seeing it.
Sorry about that.
No, we're good. So widespread group of folks that are focusing on exclusively business to consumer data exchange. So how do we eliminate some of the policy and technology and process barriers associated with making that happen? So what we did is we queried our app community and over the last few months and asked them, these are folks that are really on the bleeding edge of accessing FHIR API endpoints, finding ways where they are being able to aggregate the data on behalf of consumers. Mainly it's the provider, the clinical data right now, and then over time it's going to be the health plan data, and really ask them where their pain points were. And it kind of fell into kind of what we would call three phases, and we're going to talk about each of those three phases, kind of where we are today, where we're moving towards, and where we eventually hope that we can be. And so I'm going to talk about those three phases today. Next slide. So phase one is really the access phase, and that's really what we're in right now. Obviously, on the provider side, that was first to go live, and so we've got multiple FHIR endpoints available, mainly being provided by the EHR companies themselves. They have these app stores that actually provide either access to the FHIR endpoint that's in a publicly available location or centralized registration so that they could be able to get the OF client secret and find the ability to access this information. We eventually need to get to a point where we can provide this information in a publicly available location, as was mentioned earlier by Matt and by Wayne, and ensuring it's vendor and kind of platform agnostic, and the ONC rule is going to help us be able to do that. I think we run into some situations, or at least the apps are letting us know that they're running into situations, when multiple hospitals use the same endpoint. How will you know which hospitals are using which endpoints, and making sure that information is available? And then where are the payers going to publish their endpoints? Given the CMS rule, they also need to find ways where they can publish their endpoints, and what does that look like? There's opportunity to publish in the NPES systems, both on providers and payers, and we'll talk about that actually in a second. There are standards out there to make this happen. OpenID Connect Discovery obviously is one that could be used. The final SMART spec also includes this requirement to be able to include the smart authorization endpoints and capabilities too. But obviously the goal here is to find ways where we can use the open standards that exist today in a meaningful way so that folks can understand and know where those endpoints are being published. There's also was widespread support and encouragement that we really need to understand who the FHIR, we'll call them the FHIR SPOCs are, single points of contact at each of the client sites. One of the big challenges that the app vendors are having today is that, yes, they'll go and centrally register with the EHR vendors, for example, and then they'll get the information, but they may actually then need to reach out to the individual client sites themselves, or sometimes that process is reversed. Sometimes they have to go to the client site first to be able to get permission to turn on the endpoint and then go back to the EHR vendor to centrally register. The problem is they're using LinkedIn to actually try to find who that person is that could A, spell FHIR, and then B, help us understand if they have the authority or the permission to grant this third-party app developer access to the API on behalf of patients. You can imagine that's a very laborious process, and it's certainly not efficient. So we need that metadata stored somewhere. And so our encouragement to the industry, especially to the EHR vendors, is to understand who each of the clients are, essentially we'll call them the FHIR Spocks. Who are those folks that could be accessed to and engaged with, so that we can know who they are, and that these apps, if needed, could be able to reach out to them, and they can know, obviously, A, what the regulation says, and the idea that consumers do get access to this information, but then also B, if they need to test, if they need to be able to get approval to turn on a FHIR endpoint, that is the person that actually has the authority to make that happen. How do these providers sign up? Obviously there's the app registering with the data holder, but then there's the situation where the consumer wants to be able to make sure their providers are on the app. And so how does that happen? Obviously, Endpoint Directory is going to help. That allows the app to be able to present to the member themselves or the patient themselves which providers have actually essentially turned on the FHIR endpoint. They won't say that, but they'll be able to say, these are the providers that are available to you. Is your provider here? If not, please contact them. So that is certainly an opportunity. And then, again, we need folks to attesting to a similar set of best practices that can be enforced by the FTC, and we've published the Care and Code of Conduct to make that happen. So when apps actually register, they could be able to attest to that. Then we always get the question about who are these apps? Are there 500,000 apps out there like there are on the Apple iStore, or they're actually just a reduced number? And we can firmly say that there are not 500,000 apps out there wanting to connect to this data today. We think even at the high end, there may be only 100. We think there's more in the neighborhood of 60 or 70 that are patient-facing apps that have access some type of FHIR API endpoint in production today, either on CMS Blue Button, the VA Lighthouse Initiative, or some of the major EHR vendors that are out there. We've actually counted them. We've talked to most of them. And then we've reached out to them to ask them and to go through with them the Care and Code of Conduct and making sure that they're attested to that. And we've listed that there on the myhealthapplication.com website. So if you're a data holder, you're a consumer, you're a patient, you're others that want to get access to your data, that provides an interim step whereby you can go to know who are those apps themselves who have actually attested to the code and have actually an API in production. Let's go to phase 2. Next slide. This is what we call the trusted automations section and the phase that we're moving into. Yesterday, Julie Moss and others gave a great overview of UDAP and what's happening there in terms of how we find ways to automatically register the apps themselves. We think there's always going to be an untrusted and trusted pathways. There's 2 pathways there's always going to be a new app that's going to be developed that doesn't know exactly what the trusted pathway looks like and would knock on the data holder's door or the vendor's door and say, here I am, what do I need to do? That's really the untrusted pathway. But there's also going to be this trusted pathway where through a series of automated steps and a combination of policy and standards, you can register once and access all so that there is no whitelisting of apps. And that allows for this trusted ecosystem to exist. That's going to happen with standards like UDAP and Dynamic Client Registration, OpenID Connect and others. It's going to happen with policy through Carry Quality and the work they're doing with FHIR Implementation Guide and the Common Agreement and other things that are associated with that. It's going to as well happen with the publication of the endpoints themselves. Someone brought this to my attention the other day. NPES actually stands for National Plan and Provider Enumeration System. We haven't used it for that in the past, but this goes to the question of where do the payers actually publish their endpoints, and we're going to need to talk through that. Is it via an NPES-like system, or is it going to be the commercial sector stepping up to be able to publish the endpoint? What needs to be in the endpoint metadata? This gives you some idea and some thoughts from the app community about what they would like to see in the endpoint metadata, from the provider URL address to the OAuth URL, et cetera. Very important, this FHIR Spock, single point of contact at the individual client side of someone that they could contact to be able to address any questions and ensure there's connectivity there. And then there's other things that are associated with it as well. And then the final point is access and control over the endpoint itself. One of the concerns that we have, one of the challenges we have is that we obviously do not want to burden providers with this overhang associated with registering the apps and going through this process. They're not in the business of registering apps. Our hope is that the vendors themselves and others in the industry can find ways, the cloud vendors, whether the EHR vendors and others, to centralize the app registration process, and so that that can be done in a very trusted way, a very secure way. It's very in a standards-based way too, a way that can be done in a common way across the system, and then be able to have access to all the endpoints. The challenge with delegated access and the challenge with delegating this to the individual hospital systems themselves is we're going to run into multiple different choke points in terms of apps actually gaining access to those endpoints. And that's going to be a real problem in terms of how does an app seamlessly be able to not only register, but then find the endpoint themselves and then be able to access data on behalf of the patient. So we don't want to put those unnecessary burdens between the patient and their data in any meaningful way. And then the final slide, and we'll turn it over to the MITRE folks, is phase 3. Once we have that trusted automation in place and there's that trusted ecosystem in place in terms of standards and policy, we think ultimately there's going to be a consolidation of really a number of app registration locations that are available out there. We think that's going to consolidate around a few key areas. That's at least our hope, because the combination of that standardized national approach versus the widespread accepted industry standards is really going to help to establish that trusted app ecosystem that we need to be in place. We really don't want app registration or the ability to access these FHIR endpoints to become a gating function long term. We want it really to become a utility, and that's how we get to a real internet-based app economy that we'd like to get to in terms of how do we find solutions for how that consumer can get digital access to their information. And this automation will replace manual workflows. As the EHR vendors know all too well, the burden associated with doing app registration is really significant, and it takes a lot of time. CMS has mentioned this as well. Health plans are just starting to jump into the fold. That's a ton of work associated with that. We want to try to reduce that burden, not only on the health plan and the provider organization, the EHR vendors, but also, most importantly, to the consumer, to the patient, to the individual, making sure that that's a seamless process for them to follow. I'm going to abandon the last slide because I've already talked about it, and then I want to jump right into the MITRE demo so you guys can see what they've done.
Yeah, so this is Matt Ron real quickly. Just let the audience know that we're going to go through these slides, an overview of Lantern and then a demo, and then we'll kind of open up for discussion, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can in the remaining time. So Matt, go ahead, thanks.
Hi, thank you. All right, so my name's Matt Mayer, and we're going to be giving you a quick overview of Lantern, a FHIR API monitoring tool. We've been working on it for about a year, and I'm happy to give the debut of it today. So first of all, let's talk about what is Lantern. Lantern is a system to monitor and provide analytics about the availability and adoption of FHIR API URLs across the U.S. The mission of Lantern is to show the health of FHIR across the country by displaying key metrics gathered by monitoring the FHIR API endpoints, which overall, in the end, will ensure that patients have access to their health data. Patients can't have access to their health data if the FHIR API endpoints are unavailable or are non-conformant. The name Lantern initially came from this idea of what would it be like if every health organization in the U.S. hosting a FHIR endpoint had a lantern on their roof? And if you flew over the United States, how could you visually see the spread of FHIR use across the nation? Next slide. So let's talk about what Lantern does. Lantern queries the capability statements of published APIs, and there's emphasis on published APIs, to ensure their availability and monitor for any changes that might signal noncompliance. We collect data such as availability. So, you know, of all the amount of times that we query the capability statement, does it return an HTTP 200 every single time, signifying that it's available and that patients should be able to access their health data at that location. And we're also keeping track of their stated capabilities. And above that, so we collect all this data and then we provide visualizations that will provide insight into the availability and compliance of these endpoints, so that people tracking the standard can sort of get an idea of what resources are being used commonly, how long does it take for people to upgrade their standard the version of FHIR that they're implementing on these servers, that sort of thing. Next slide. Yeah, so as I mentioned before, Lantern is collecting data about the endpoints from their capability statements, which are hosted at the metadata endpoint. You don't need to authenticate with the server to get the capability statement. That's really important. Lantern is not authenticating with all of these servers. We're getting all of our information about each of these endpoints just by looking at the capability statements. And the things inside the capability statements that we're recording, obviously the FHIR version, the different mechanisms you can use for authentication that the capability statement advertises, what resources that the capability statement says that endpoint supports, the sort of actions that can be performed on that server, as well as the software and product version. So, you know, whose product is behind this endpoint, and then using a combination of these sorts of things, you might be able to get a better idea of which vendors are supporting what, which vendors have higher availability, perhaps, which vendors are quick to implement the most recent FHIR versions, that sort of thing. And so next slide, I'll start talking about where Lantern gets its data. And this is a important piece that Wayne and Ryan had sort of talked about before, is like, where do we get all these endpoints? Where do we find them so that we know which URLs to query in the first place? Lantern right now is using published FHIR API endpoints, which are published by the vendors themselves as part of the 21st Century Cures Act. The vendors are supposed to publish in a computable format a list of their FHIR endpoints, and these are the lists that Lantern is consuming. We combine the information that we gather from querying the capability statements of those endpoints with information from Chapel, so you can get product and vendor information from Chapel, as well as certification status for different health IT products. And we're also using NPES to get information about the organizations behind those endpoints. NPES will, give you the organization name, a unique identifier, which is important, as well as the location. And typically the pattern that we've seen is that the vendors who publish the API endpoint lists will give you, obviously, the service-based URL and an organization name. Organization names are by no means unique. So part of what Lantern does is it searches through NPES to try and find the most likely match for an organization that is behind that endpoint. The only way to get a perfect match is to have a unique identifier, such as an MPI ID associated with an endpoint, which NPES's endpoint file actually provides. So next slide. We'll talk about what Lantern can be used for. So if you're looking at an endpoint list and you want to determine what the quality of it is, you're hoping that if you're going to consume that list in maybe your third-party FHIR app, you'd want all of those endpoints to return 200. You want them all to be active, or else you're going to be trying to connect to a dead server, or you might be telling patients that they can connect to some server to get certain organizations' patient data, and that server is not even there. So a big use case of it would be, well, how many endpoints on this vendor's list are even active? And then you can also use this sort of data to gain insights into how FHIR is being supported on these servers. How many servers in the United States support the medication resource, for example? Or, how many servers supporting FHIR version R4 also support Smart on FHIR? Hopefully all of them, but these are the types of answers, these are the types of questions you couldn't have answers to unless you're aggregating all of the capability statement results in one place. Sort of a tangential use of Lantern is endpoint discovery. So each of these vendors are publishing their endpoint lists in computable formats, yes, but they're not standardized computable formats, meaning that if you want to consume all these lists, you're going to have to make many different interfaces for each list. Lantern has made those interfaces. We've consumed the endpoint lists, meaning that we have a single aggregated list available in one place. Part of Lantern allows you to, and you'll see this in the demo, to filter based on different criteria. So if you want to see all FHIR R4 endpoints, you can filter on that. If you want to see all, endpoints from vendor X that are FHIR version R4, you can also filter that and then download a list of the results. The list contains obviously the URL, the organization that we have matched it to, the accepted HTTP headers that endpoint will accept, as well as other information. Next slide. And just to show you an example, and I think Ryan's phase 2 slide had sort of alluded to this, and I thought that was interesting, and we actually have some numbers to sort of back that up, is the NPES data file includes endpoints, FHIR endpoints. Inside their list, entries with endpoint type FHIR are supposed to contain FHIR URLs. So just as we do with all other vendor endpoint lists, we consume this list, and then we're able to query all of those endpoints based on the URLs provided and determine statistics about that list. And this is what we came up with for NPES. There were 255 entries that were supposed to contain FHIR URLs. 84 of those actually were URLs. There were many that were, maybe email addresses. Some of them said Apple Computer, for example. So clear data quality issues. So of the 84 that were actually URLs, now we can use Lantern to determine things about what's behind those URLs by checking for their capability statement. Of the 84 URLs, 44 were unique, meaning that 40 of the URLs were duplicates, but that's okay because they may be duplicates in the sense that the same URL is servicing several different MPI IDs, several different organizations. And of those 84 URLs, only 11 responded with an HTTP 200. So we were able to sort of objectively discern that this endpoint list is out of date. It's not something that you would, as a third-party FHIR app developer, would want to be consuming and using as a source of truth in your application. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Mike for a live demo of the Lantern application.
Thank you, Matt. Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Mike Milzel. I'm from the MITRE Corporation, and I will be giving a demonstration of the dashboard front end that we've built on top of Lantern. This is a web-based interface that lets you explore and filter the results from Lantern's querying of the endpoint database. What I am showing you here is a preview of the next iteration of Lantern. It's a little more capable than what's currently on the Lantern website, but will be coming soon. And the data that's in here includes data that is for testing purposes. So what you see on the production website may differ from what's shown here. But this will give you a feel for the capabilities of Lantern and the features that it provides. The main dashboard screen that we're looking at now shows a summary of the current endpoint metrics. So we have a total of 3,500 total endpoints that we are querying in our database. We have managed to reach out to all 3,500 of them. As new endpoints get added, they may show up here as non-indexed. That means we have added a new endpoint but haven't reached out and queried it yet. That could be because there's just no network connection to that endpoint yet, or we haven't gone through our daily query for that endpoint yet. We have a summary of the current successful responses. So we see just over 3,300 are currently returning a 200 success. 100 of them are returning a 404 not found. So perhaps the URL is incorrect, or it's out of date, or the service has moved, or there's some other change that we're not aware of. So that's something that we would want to investigate. Why are we getting 404s for these endpoints? And then luckily, none of them are currently providing an unavailable. So we're either able to reach out and get success on some of these endpoints. Some of them are missing, and none of them are returning unavailable at the moment. Down below, we see a summary of the endpoint counts by vendor and FHIR version. You'll notice that some of them are listed as unknown for either vendor name or FHIR version. This is because Lantern takes a very strict approach to this information. We are going by only what is returned in the actual capability statement to us. So if an endpoint is unreachable, we will report it as unknown. If an endpoint is reachable, but it's not returning a valid capability statement, it will be reported as unknown. Or if it is a valid capability statement, but it doesn't actually contain vendor information in the vendor field, that'll be reported as unknown. So there are a variety of reasons why something may be reported as unknown. But this is always based on the most current crawl of our endpoints. And we can see a breakdown of which vendors and which FHIR versions are available in each. And again, this includes some test data, so what is shown on production will differ slightly from this. Further down, we see a summary of all endpoint responses over time. So we see that almost all of our endpoints have returned a success at one point or another. A small number of endpoints have been unreachable at some point in time. And generally, we want to see this success 200 bar be nice and tall. But if we see that some of the other error bars start creeping up, that may be a reason to investigate, particularly something like the 404 not found. Why is that endpoint URL not reachable? Why is it incorrect, or is there some other error that's causing that? External server errors, internal server errors, those can pop up from time to time based on network traffic and load and other, vagaries of the internet weather. But basically, we want to see the 200 success be the one that has the most. And this is filterable by vendor as well. Once you've seen the summary of dashboard metrics, now you can get a view of the list of the endpoints that we are currently monitoring in our database. Again, this is broken down by FHIR version or by vendor, so I can drill down to see specific sets that I'm interested in. I have the ability to search and filter on all of the columns. I can sort by each column. And then once I get the set of endpoints that I might be interested in, I can download that as a CSV file. And as Matt said, that will include various information, not just what's shown on the table, but some additional fields as well. So this can allow you to do your own exploration of endpoints, do your own analysis, or use this list to feed into other work that you do. We keep track of server availability. This table is just showing endpoints that have returned something besides a 200, and we can see that the error bars for most of these are 404. This represents the not found errors. So we can see that, yeah, if it's not found, it's going to stay not found for a while. Other endpoints may return some intermittent errors, such as these endpoints, which are returning a 504. So this can give you some insight as to the health of the endpoints. If we start seeing lots of different bars stacking up on top of each other, and we're getting a variety of different responses, that means there's probably some issue with maintaining the endpoint on the provider's end, and we'd want to look into that. In addition, successful endpoints are not always 100% successful, so we can keep track of which endpoints have returned something less than 100% or less than 99.8% success. So this can give you an idea of if a particular endpoint has been dropping off in its availability. Once we have reached out and gotten a successful response from an endpoint, we can then go and parse what we find in the resource structure in the capability statement. So this allows us to pull out all of the reported resource types. Again, we are just grabbing the capability statement. We are not actually going and doing any sort of intrusive testing on these resources. But to give you an idea of the reported support for the different resource types. So again, we can filter by FHIR version and vendor and see how they support resource types across all of the endpoints. So some of them may be supported across a large number, and others may be supported by only a few endpoints. So this gives you sort of an idea of how the resource support goes across vendor and FHIR version. And again, this is based on the most recent response from a successful query of an endpoint. Inside the capability statement, we can look at the required fields and get an idea of the support for those. Ideally, this should match the number of endpoints for that particular FHIR version. If there's some endpoints which are not responding, they won't show up in report required fields. In addition to the required fields, we can also query the optional fields and see how those are supported by the different endpoints. Again, filterable by FHIR version and vendor as well. Here we can see that all of the three FHIR version 301 endpoints are supporting the required fields. We do keep track of the response time for querying endpoints. This is not a metric we're putting a lot of weight on, but it does give an overall health status in terms of the responsiveness across all of the endpoints that we are looking at. It will depend on your physical proximity to the endpoint, your network hosting, your internet provider, bandwidth, network traffic on a given day. So there's not a lot of weight put on this for any individual endpoint, but as an overall metric for the entire ecosystem, it can give a warning if we see performance time degrading and seeing an uptick in the overall response time across all endpoints. That may suggest that these endpoints are becoming heavily used, or it may suggest that they are fighting for bandwidth, and that better hosting support or better bandwidth may be necessary to maintain good performance. Endpoints also support reporting the authorization types they support. This is, again, pulled out of the capability statement directly, so we can see the number that have returned a successful response, the numbers that have provided a capability statement with a valid security resource, and we see there is a slight discrepancy between the number that have been successfully queried and the number with a valid security resource in their capability statement. We can break it down by the authorization type, FHIR version, and we can see that Smart on FHIR is reported at 100% across all of these endpoints, which is what we want to see. Other authorization types, maybe not so much, although, again, this includes data for testing purposes, so what you may see on production will differ slightly from this. And then once you've determined which authorization type you're interested in, again, you can filter the list of endpoints and get that information. Smart core capabilities should be reported by endpoints at a well-known smart configuration URI appended to the end of the base URL. And this is something that we were surprised to see much lower than we were expecting. But we will be querying the well-known endpoint URL and getting a response back and validating that it's valid JSON, and then examining the capabilities reported in that. So for right now, we're looking at a paltry 9 endpoints that have returned valid JSON for us at this endpoint for the core capabilities. We'll hopefully see that number go up in the future, but we've got a list of the ones that have reported valid JSON to us listed here. And then finally, we are looking at, my map's not drawing correctly. Just see, a reload brings that back. There we go. We're looking at mapping organization locations. Again, dealing with this list of endpoints, an endpoint is just a computer in the cloud somewhere. Mapping it to an organization at least gives us an idea of where this endpoint perhaps is servicing a particular patient population. This is pulled from the NPES provider registry, so it's mapping to the primary address of the organization that Lantern has mapped the endpoint information to. It may not actually represent any clinical service location. It may be a corporate headquarters or other entity, but at least we're working on providing some information that correlates endpoints with physical locations so that you can explore and investigate where particular endpoint services, FHIR versions, vendor support may be. We realize there's a lot of fuzziness around mapping, say, an endpoint that provides 100 different provider organizations under a single URL, or 100 provider organizations that have their own unique URL. But we'll be working on providing a geospatial way of exploring endpoints, so you can, say, filter by state, FHIR version, vendor, and so on. And finally, Lantern is meant to be open and transparent. It's an open source project. All of the code and documentation is available, and we desperately want your feedback on this. We want any corrections that you may have, any recommendations for features or functionality that you want to see. It's going to be successful based on your feedback. So there is a Lantern support email address that you can send any and all feedback to, and we'll be happy to respond. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Matt, I guess, and see if he has can answer any questions or has anything additional to say about Lantern.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Yeah, if you can bring up the slideshow, and we'll leave the URL up on there, so people can feel free to go check out lantern.healthit.gov. Just be forewarned, if there's a lot of people who are going and just hitting it immediately right now, you might experience a little bit of slowness, but check back later and it should be all set. And like Mike said, if you have any questions or if you need to report any incorrect data, or maybe suggest some other publicly available endpoint list that we haven't yet consumed, please, please, please contact us at lanternsupport@groups.miter.org. And with that, I'll hand it back to the moderator, Matt.
Thanks everyone. Great overview and demo there from Mike and Matt. And as Mike mentioned, this is launched today. Today is the first day it's being publicly announced at lantern.healthit.gov. I'm gonna focus more on the questions that are less Lantern specific, because we do have a virtual booth in the exhibit hall that you can get more info from if you wanted to ask more specific questions. But I hope some of the questions that were being asked were answered in the last little bit of Mike's presentation there. I did want to ask Wayne and Ryan, and maybe Ryan can take this, but we did get a question. It seems like the FHIR single point of contact is only necessary when a health system individually approves patient apps, which isn't necessarily the case, and procures won't be the case in the future. A health system FHIR single point of contact potentially places a lot of burden on a health system. Why is this necessary?
So as with anything in healthcare, it's an iterative process in terms of, a phased-in approach. We'd like to say that all the providers have their own individual portals in place, which we've come to find out, and our app community has let us know that that's not necessarily the case, and that was many years ago. So I think in some senses, I think the questioner is correct. There may be situations where health systems has fully dedicated all of the decisions to their vendors, including turning on the API endpoint, to the policies associated with how that actually works, the testing, to anything that needs to be done with the vendor. That may be 100% delegated to the vendor as far as how they deal with the apps. There may be other situations where the health system themselves is taking on maybe all of that responsibility themselves, and there may be a hybrid. In fact, we think that at least what we're seeing in the wild today, our app vendors are seeing in the wild today, is a hybrid approach where the EHR vendor is doing certain tasks associated with that. The provider is and the health system is actually needing to do some tasks associated with that, and then the app actually does some tasks. So we think that hybrid approach is going to continue, and I think our recommendation around FHIR Spock is really just this idea that the three groups together need to work together in order to make sure that the endpoint is turned on. And I think Matt and Mike's demo proved that very clearly and succinctly, that some are live, some are not, accuracy and integrity endpoint, et cetera. And I think it's a three-way group effort to help make this work.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate that. Wayne, did you have anything to add to that?
Not to that question, no.
Okay.
I think it's fine. I agree.
So we need to go to a question. Would it be possible to extend this to legacy standards such as IHE endpoints on the care quality network? If Matt or Mike want to take that. And by this, they mean Lantern.
Okay. Can you reword that question?
So, would it be possible to extend Lantern to legacy standards such as IHE endpoints on the care quality network and not just specific to FHIR?
Yeah, I understand it now. I think it would be possible, but that's not the initial intent of Lantern. Lantern is a tool to monitor FHIR specifically.
Yes. This is for Ryan and/or Wayne. How do you clearly link a patient to their payer or prior payer ID so we can do payer-to-payer and other work in CMS rule? We need this before we can discover the correct endpoint.
Yeah, so payer-to-payer goes live in 2021. We're just trying to get to 2022, my apologies. They go live in 2022. We're just trying to get to 2021. So first step is we need to get access to the individual needs to get access to their own data from their current payer. And then the question becomes, how do we solve the payer-to-payer problem? So there's some groups that are focusing on that. We are, Da Vinci has a few others. ONC FAST is working on that too. Don't have solid answer for you right now, but they're, through digital identity and a few other things that are working, I think there's opportunities. Matt, I just wanted to address one question that we've gotten a lot of too around FHIR API directory versus this Lantern API monitoring tool. Can you just make sure we can clarify, this is not a FHIR API directory, and Matt, I think Matt mentioned this when he talked about this. They're going out to publicly available sources to look at the publicly available FHIR API directories that are there and pulling them into Lantern, and then Lantern does the monitoring, but this is not a national FHIR API directory. I don't want to put words in Matt's mouth, but I think he alluded to that when he talked about the demo.
Well, I think that highlights the need to discuss where it fits and what are the next steps, Ryan, because absolutely, I mean, Lantern's a tool that can be used to monitor and track and help people understand, the status of endpoints, for example. But as you saw, the limitations where we're getting the core data into it. And in terms of what do we do with it, I think that's the industry challenge right now. I think we need to put together some sort of a service. I think you've used the term, Ryan, some sort of a standardized, centralized utility that sort of works like ICANN does, domain names and things, so that, it's out there. And in order to, once there's some sort of a service bureau, that's going to need some help as well in terms of stewardship and curation, and so there need to be some funding for that. And once that's in place, you need to motivate the vendors to provide the endpoints. That was another limitation of what the data lantern could get access to, that it was just getting the various groups to actually provide the endpoints, which do need a little bit of probably some compelling factor to do. And then we have to deal with the quality and the quality of the data that's there, so it's actually usable and accurately representing what's really happening and ensuring that there's compliance in place with what the rules are. And so I think what we need to do is to begin sort of getting the industry to work together on finding a workable solution to help make this a usable reality. I've done only one small thing right now, which is set up a discussion stream on chat.phir.org under the name Endpoint Discovery, and so I think that's one way we can collect some input. But I think it's the challenge really is on the industry in a way like Project Argonaut or Da Vinci took on the challenge of trying to solve particular applications of FHIR to solve healthcare problems. This is another one we have to deal with, and so I think we need to work together and figure out a path forward and some sort of a hosting group to actually take over this moving ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. I definitely, so this is Matt. I know we only have 1 or 2 minutes left, but, if in that time, and if Ryan, can you kind of expand on, what you think the next step should be on what, Wayne just mentioned?
Well,
how we
I
solve
think
this
that
issue.
there's a lot of great questions we didn't have time to answer, so let's continue the conversation, and Wayne was kind enough to put it in the FHIR chat. Let's continue the conversation online. I think to the points that were mentioned earlier, if we can come together, if folks were interested in having this conversation, I know we're having a lot of dialogue within Karen about that. We'd be happy to be a place where at least we could have the dialogue. If folks want to talk live, if folks want to talk online, the chat.phir.org website is the place to do that. We just need to find some answers to it. And I think at a minimum, I think what's necessary from next steps perspective is we need to know where all these endpoints are being publicly listed today. And let's use the MITRE tool, the specifically MITRE team, as to being able to publish where all of these publicly available endpoints are going to be listed so that they have an accurate list. They've got a starter set now. And then let's move to the next stage, which is where are we going to publish it in a single location kind of going forward, if in fact that's what the community wants to do.
So thanks, Ryan. So I do need to wrap up in the interest of time, but so thank you, Wayne, Ryan, Mike, and Matt for joining us today. And we will try to find a way to answer those questions. I want to thank everyone for joining the session, and we had a great discussion, and hopefully be, pushing forward with, a movement forward on the next steps on how we can find the FHIR endpoints. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of the sessions today.
Thank you, everyone. There will now be a 1 hour and 15-minute break for lunch. Please plan to join us for the next working session starting at 1 p.m. Eastern. Thank you.